Yeah,
Welcome, Oliver. Thank you so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books.
yeah, you're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Oh my gosh, this is like Christmas in my house, which I don't even celebrate Christmas, but it would be like Christmas. It's like the greatest thing to be interviewing you. My kids were freaking out. I have four kids, and they are obsessed. My little guy loves How to Catch a Star, and obviously the crayons and everything else. So
Oh, well, I'm
delighted,
honored. Thank you.
delighted to talk to you. So let's start by talking about your new book, which I only have on my iPad here. What We'll Build, which beautiful illustrations per usual and thought-provoking text. Tell me a little bit about your latest book and what kind of inspired this one and why now?
Well, why now? Uh, and what inspired it are both the same thing, which is we had a second child, a daughter, and it's I joked that I'd better write her a book because I'd never hear the end of it if my son had a book and she didn't. But really, it was. I was going through, similar internal dialogues about the state of the world and what it's like to be raising a child, and especially this time around that this is the first. It's not the first time we've had a child, but it's the first time we've had a daughter, and she's actually the first female Jeffers in four generations, so
Wow.
quite some time. And just thinking about, the timing and the feeling and the zeitgeist of this moment where so much change is possible, not guaranteed, but possible. And the idea of raising a daughter in what will hopefully no longer be a man's world, just it feels like a special time to be trying to do that. And really that was one aspect of it, but it's also with Here We Are, if that book was about um, trying to understand the world as it is and break it down in its simplest terms, which sort of covers the strangeness that comes with being a parent for the first time, then we had already experienced that. So our thoughts were able to turn more fully to the future when looking at this brand new bundle of life in our arms. And so it's if Here We Are is about changing or if Here We Are is about explaining the world as it is, then What We'll Build is about possibly changing it. And just in those the quiet hours in the middle of the night, as I was nursing her back to sleep, I would just sort of be imagining these things and saying these. At some point or other, I just started to write it down, and then it came quite organically and quite naturally.
Wow. So you just have to keep having kids and you'll just have more and more original
Don't know
content.
about that. Yeah, I'm
How
getting
old
old.
how old is your son?
He's 5. He turned 5 in the summer.
Okay. I have a 5-year-old also who they must like just he must eat up these books like crazy. I mean, how cool to have a
Yeah,
dad who does this.
well, he does, but I don't try to ram them down his throat either, because I was never a big reader when I was a kid, because it always felt like something that you had to do for homework.
Hmm.
It always felt like a chore, and it wasn't until I discovered books on my own terms that I became an avid reader, and that was later in life. And I just had, I don't know, sort of this deep-seated fear that if I tried to make him do something, it would actually put him off. So, but he does. He goes to books, but he actually likes reference books more. Like books that explain things. He's definitely more like his mother in that sense, where she's an engineer, so he likes things that to be explained logically. But he also likes dinosaurs and diggers. And my daughter, on the other hand, I think is a lot more similar to me, just
Excellent.
in terms of chaos and creativity.
So what types of books got you reading?
What types of books got me reading? I mean, there are books that I enjoyed when I was a kid, for sure. I think the first book that I read because I wanted to read it was a Roald Dahl book.
Hmm.
I had read the BFG for school, and it was the first book that didn't feel like homework. It felt like a treat, and then I just went and read his entire backlog. But honestly, it wasn't until much later in life that I became, a read every single day type of person. And it was mostly, and I mostly read nonfiction, believe it or not, because there's so many interesting things that have actually happened in the world. I want to find out about all those things, about how everything affects everything else. And it was in trying to, when I realized that there was, I can't even remember what it was, but there was something that I didn't understand. I was like, well, let me read about that. And because it was on my terms and I wanted to find out about it, it was a very different experience.
Interesting. Yeah, I remember growing up, my parents had like these encyclopedias, which were all really fancy and bound and everything. And I remember being like, wow, I could just learn about anything I want. I'm just going to pull this thing out and let's see what I find.
Yeah.
And yeah, the
No.
power, the
And when
power in that.
Yeah. We moved to the US 15 years ago, and I realized that all the classic books that they teach in schools here in Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom. They were all, Emily Bronte, Charles Dickens, things like that. And when I got to the USA, I realized there was a whole different genre of classic books that were American classic books. And I think I found a list of like the 100 classic American novels, and I've sort of been slowly working my way through them. So, discovered John Steinbeck that way, and Ken Casey, and that's been a real pleasure.
So take me from what happened when you started reading Roald Dahl books and to like here. When did you know that you wanted to produce books? Like, when did you start illustrating and writing, and when did all that brew up inside you?
From when I was a kid, I've always loved drawing and making things, and a lot of the art, looking back on it now, has been very narrative driven. So there is that old Picasso quote, all children are artists. The trick is just remembering how whenever you grow up. And when people ask me when did I start making art, I tend to ask them, well, when did you stop? Because we all made art at some point. Then all adults just sort of stopped and moved on to different things. I just never did. But when did it occur to me to actually make a book? I think from when I started thinking about real life jobs and so on, once I learned that making art was a real life job, I knew that was going to be for me. And I started to work my way into a system. The university experience is very different in the UK and Ireland than it is in the USA, whereas here you have to start specializing really from the age of 15, and then you pick your degree, your subject, and then you pick where you want to go. Whereas in the US, it's you pick your college and then you pick what you want to study. So it's a much different system here, and I think it suits fewer people here, because who knows what they want to do when they're 15. But I'm one of the fortunate people that did know, because I knew that I wanted to make art, and I got into art college, and it was only at the very, very end of my art college, and I thought I was going to be a painter, which is still something that I do. I have two completely separate careers. And I had this concept for a series of canvases, but it occurred to me that maybe these canvases would be better served as a book. And so I made a book in my last year of college. And then I went about trying to get that book published. And when I was showing that to publishers, both in London and New York, the question was asked, do you have other ideas, or is this a one-off? And I said, it was like, oh no, I've got lots of ideas. I didn't really. I was just like, I think that's the answer they want to hear. And ever since then, it's just been, the switch was very easy for me, and books came very, very naturally. And just today I realized that it's almost 20 years since I first made How to Catch a Star.
Wow. And it's still like, it's so relevant and so beautiful. And like, I go to bed reading it with my son. It's so crazy, right? When you think like your ideas are in my house every night. It's just the magic of picture books. It's really unbelievable.
No, and I try not to break it down and take it apart to see how it works ever, because I just out of fear that it won't ever be put back together. So it's such a strange thought that the work that I do alone in the studio then goes out and has a life of its own. And it's easier just not to think about that than to really contemplate what that means.
Wow. So how you keep obviously creating lots of stories. Do they just sort of occur to you? Like, how does something trigger you to decide this is going to be my next book?
Well, I have lots of ideas for stories that never really fully materialize rather into stories, because every good story, every good picture book has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And some of these ideas that I had, they might have just been the middle. It might, it was a gimmick or an interesting visual, or didn't have one of those three things, or couldn't really be fleshed out enough into a picture book. And so my sketchbook was riddled with those ideas. And then at one point I thought, these don't have all that it takes to be a full picture book, but maybe I could do a book of short picture books. And that book became Once Upon an Alphabet. And so that really was me just plundering through my sketchbooks and lifting out the choicest ideas, and then attributing one to each letter. And there was a few holes, so I had to think up ones from scratch. But honestly, each book happens in a different way. Like Stuck is partially based on a true story. The Incredible Book-Eating Boy, the whole story came from both an art project that I was doing with a scientist in quantum physics, and just a simple drawing that I made, and I connected the two things. And then The Fate of Fausto, I don't really know where that came from. I took a drive up the north coast of Northern Ireland, and I pulled a car over just on the cliffs in the absolute middle rural of nowhere, and I took a nap as I was watching this storm come in, and I woke up and that book was just on the tip of my tongue, and I just put pencil to paper, and it came out pretty much as is. So who knows where that came from? And then other ones are, Here We Are was originally written as a letter to my son, and the same with What Will Build. So there's not a formula. Each one is slightly different, and sometimes they're quite tricky to pick the lock of. Like Stuck, that based on really getting a kite stuck in a tree and really getting some other stuff caught in the tree, but I didn't know how it ended, and I sat on it for 6 months, 8 months, maybe a year before watching my nephews play, and just forgetting about one game and moving on to the other, that I realized that, well, maybe it doesn't have to end. Maybe they just he just gets distracted and moves on, and that proved to be the perfect ending. So it's different for every case.
Wow. And then my daughter wanted me to ask you how you came up with the design for the crayons.
Well, they're crayons.
I know, like the actual, I don't know, like the faces and the making them so human, and I don't know, like how you came up with it. I didn't say it was a great question, but that's her question, so I'm going with it.
It was fun to come up with the design for the crayons box, because I wanted it to be completely unique and not associated with any existing crayons brand, and so it was. I think it was based on I saw an ad in a magazine for like a packet of candy with that color spectrum, and like an old time magazine or something like that. And I was like, oh, that's how that will do. But really, it's the simplicity of it. When I saw that story, I just knew that this book had to be done so simply. You couldn't overdo it, because it would ruin the obviousness of the whole thing. So the letters had to be written like as if you got them in a stack. The crayons themselves had to be characters, and so that's gouache paint, and that's it's the simplest way that I could have drawn them and make them look like physical objects. And then of course everything else in the book is a crayon drawing. So it was like, well, what are the laws of just logic that would apply to this if this really happened? And then I just went from there.
Wow. So how do you, some books you illustrate only, and some books you write and illustrate. Are you still like a for hire illustrator? I can't imagine you are.
I never have been. And I always said I would never illustrate somebody else's book until I was tricked into looking at the Crayons manuscripts. And the editor that I work with then in New York called me into his office and then says, oh, I got to leave to take a phone call. Don't look at anything on my desk. So of course I went over and looked, and that was sitting face up, and I read it and was like, oh, this is a really great concept. It's so just obvious what should be done. I was like, I hope whoever does this does it the right way. And then my editor came back in and I said, who's illustrating this? And he goes, no one yet. Why are you interested? And I was like, I knew exactly what you were doing, but I couldn't not do it. And then the only other book I've illustrated that hasn't been a Crayons book was with Owen Colfer, who we're friends, and we had this, or he had this, we just basically says, yeah, we should work together. Artists and authors that meet on literary festivals always say that sort of stuff, and it never happens. But then about 2 weeks later, Owen says, I've got this idea that I think might be perfect for you. And I read it and I was like, that is pretty good, actually. And I was like, well, what about I do it this way? And he goes, perfect. And then it was just that simple. And then actually there's another book, but it's unclear. People said, well, who wrote it? Who illustrated it? And Sam Winston and I both said, well, we both did. We both wrote it and we both illustrated it. And that was born out of just meeting this person, becoming friends with them, and realizing that all of our work, all of our overhead just overlaps so much. And we said we should do a project. And we started doing what we thought was an art project that then morphed into a picture book. So it's been organic every single time.
Okay. So all the authors out there who would salivate for your help with illustrations can now just say, forget it, that's off the table.
Sadly,
off the table.
And because I still work in the fine art world, it's, even my schedule over the next couple of years is mostly sort of based in like public sculptures and paintings. So it's a strange sort of a mix. It's like and I've always laughed at like authors who they want to collaborate. It was like, yeah, that's 15 minutes of work for you, and it's a year's work for me. So it's not that straightforward.
And what is it like? Like, tell me where you do the drawings, like what materials you use, like just the process of illustrating a book.
Again, it's different book by book. My studio was in Brooklyn in New York, although I haven't been there in some time because we were traveling before this pandemic hit, and then we came back to Northern Ireland to be with family. So what we'll build is, that's all paint on paper. It's acrylic paint and a little bit of ink and some colored pencil on paper. Here we are was some ink washes that was then finished on Procreate on an iPad. The Incredible Book Eating Boy was all collage with acrylic paint. The Lost and Found, How to Catch a Star, they were all watercolor. And then the Fate of Fausto, just because I wanted to make life exceptionally difficult for myself, I experimented with a completely different media, which is lithographic printing. And so there is no original piece of art for that per se, because it was all made on stone and on metal plates, layer by layer, color by color. And then those plates and stones were sort of destroyed in the process of making them. So it was completely different, and I really didn't know what was going to come out the other end of the printer.
Have you figured out what it is about your style that is so appealing to others? And maybe that's too sort of self-referential, but maybe that's more for me to say, but have you kind of analyzed it when you start a new project?
I try not to, but I think there's a directness and a simplicity and an honesty to it, where I'm just clearly enjoying myself, and that's just the way that I write. That's just the way that I do a straight line. That's just the way that it will look like if I do this. And I'm not trying to be anybody else. I'm not trying to be something I'm not. And it's just I don't know. There's maybe an integrity and a mild sophistication enough in it that I'm not trying to pander to anyone. I don't know. Owen Colfer's son, who was 18 at the time, asked me with all sincerity, he was like, "Why are your drawings so popular?" And I thought about it for a second. I was like, I think that might be an insult.
No, that is not an insult.
Yeah, because it sort of was like, they're so simple and so easy. Why do people like them? I was like, I don't know.
Yeah, that's funny. Trust a child to say something like that. So what advice would you have for an illustrator, an artist, a child who was like you as a child, just sketching and not wanting to stop? How do you have them not give up?
Well, there's two things spring to mind. One, if you look at successful people, there are plenty of successful people that have all drive and little talent, and there are almost no successful people who are all talent with no drive. But the advice that I generally tend to give young and aspiring artists and illustrators is an Oscar Wilde quote, which is, "Be yourself. Everybody else is already taken."
That's a great quote. And what's coming next? What are your next books that we have to look forward to?
That's a great question. I don't know. I haven't been on my studio in well over a year. As I say, we were traveling from the start of last summer, and we planned to take a year off to travel. It took us about 5 years to prepare for it, and so we set off end of last July, and we were intending to return just at the end of the summer. But obviously, in about February or so, that all came sort of crashing to a halt, and we ended up moving somewhere that we don't normally live, and I'm just sort of trying to find a new rhythm and see what's going to happen next. So I do have a book project in mind, but it's too early to say anything, and if that doesn't work, frankly, I have no idea.
Are there more Crayons books coming?
No, the last one, the Crayons Christmas, has come out,
and that's it.
And I think there was another like a Crayons book of colors, or there was like a concept book like that. I think the art was made quite some time ago, but I think that's already come out. So yeah, that's that. That's
it. End of the line for the Crayons. They really quit. Okay. Well, thank you for coming on the show. Thanks for all the hours of great quality time that I've spent with my children because of you, and best of luck with the new book, and thank you.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate the kind words. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.